Good afternoon. It's good to be here with you. I'm excited for the opportunity to walk through a little bit of research that we've been doing. And it's a long presentation, so I'm going to dive right in. Over the last several years, we've been doing what we call the high-performing post research. You can see the series there. And what we do is we bring all the financially or the publicly available financial data together through a model that our High Performance Business Institute has developed. And we run that model and rank the organizations that we study. This year there were 30 of them, from 1 to 30. And then we look at the top tier, and we look across them in a much more or less analytical and more objective way of what are they doing that we could say would be common across the high performers that would be indicative of high performance. And so what I'll walk you through is a little bit from that research this year, and then some additional research that we've done out of our retail practice. What I find very interesting, at least, is our retail practice likes to talk a lot about you guys and what's going on in the logistics space. So we've got some research from there, and then some very specific consumer research we did around a couple topics. So, and if you'd like the report, it's available at Accenture.com, or just give me your card and I'm happy to send you the full report. No big surprise here. Mail volumes are declining. You see that there are 4 markets where we saw increases last year. You heard from one of them this morning, Austria Post, and what they've been doing in the ad mail space. They've been very successful in bending the slope of that curve and bringing mail volumes in, and they're doing that both domestically and within their region as well, with some cross-border products. What I found most interesting is what we're seeing from a profitability standpoint. Mail, the 30 organizations that we looked at, average EBIT of 6.4% on their mail business versus non-mail activities of 4.7% EBIT. And if you look at the high performers, just that top tier, what you find is their EBIT on mail is 14%. So profitability is still to be found in the mailing business. And what we're finding is that as the non-mail activities of the postal organizations mature, we would expect to see that EBIT continue to rise. And that certainly varies by the different business lines. Different story on the parcel side. Parcel volumes are growing in most markets. These are the postal organizations' parcel volumes. You see a few at the end that are dealing with some very specific situations, but in general, we're seeing good growth in the parcel space, and that is primarily, as everybody knows in this room, being driven by e-commerce. So out of the research, there were 4 findings, and I'm going to go through these quickly because I want to be able to focus in a little bit on finding 2. So the first, the high performers, as you look at those, they're driving great profitability out of their mail business, but they're driving growth out of diversification. And so while we see a 14% EBIT on the mail side, we see year over year 3% growth being driven by diversification. And that's whether you look at it at a 1-year, a 3-year, or a 5-year compound annual growth rate. It's remarkably consistent at 3%. They're able to drive growth while defending their core business. We'll talk a lot about what it means to become a digital business, so I want to skip over that one for just a second. High performers are operating with a strong commercial focus. If you look at the correlation between private ownership or non-government ownership of a postal organization and high performance, the top 10 performers in our study had an average private ownership of 60%. So the government owned on average 40% of those posts. If you look at the bottom 10, the government owns 90%. And if you look at the bottom 5, they're all 100% owned by government organizations. That doesn't mean that you have to privatize to be a high performer. Poste Italiane, for example, is in that group of high performers, and while they're thinking about privatization, they are not privatized yet. But you do have to operate with a commercial focus. And that means taking the politics out of those decisions and making them on a business-driven economic decision that you've seen from a number of our presenters this morning. And then the high performers are taking full advantage of the parcel growth. They're transforming their parcel networks, and we're seeing them gain great market share. In their domestic markets, they have about a 40% market share. And if you get to that 40% market share in your domestic market on the parcel side, you're probably in that high performer category. Versus the low performers where we see about a 17% domestic market share. So the low performers have lost that domestic advantage that they once had. The high performers have done a great job of defending that domestic market. So as we looked at this, this phenomena of what's going on, both from a digital and a parcel side, we said 17% global B2C e-commerce growth, less than 5% volume growth from the organizations that we study. What's causing the discrepancy, and what do we see from a competitive landscape? And what we found is that there are three distinct competitors. The top global integrators, it's a very simple value proposition. Integrate once, access to the world, and as these e-commerce companies in particular become more global, that value proposition becomes more valuable. And so Post lose out when they're not able to operate as a global network. Local or domestic competitors, what we saw initially was that they had very niche offerings. We're now seeing them start to experiment with end-to-end, get into last mile sorts of solutions. And I think we'll see that experiment continue as they pick up densities in certain markets. And then the last, excuse me, is e-tailers and retailers moving into this space. Thomas Kipp this morning talked a little bit about that. We're seeing aggressive investment by e-tailers and retailers in their own delivery networks. Whether you look at what Amazon has announced that they're going to do with the 40 largest markets in the US, if you look at what Alibaba has done with their recent purchases or the formation of that new consortium, e-tailers and retailers are clearly experimenting in this space. So the answer to that, we think, is digital. And just real quick to pop this up, digital is huge, right? It's one of the most disruptive things going on in the industry. And this just gives you a little sense of what happens every minute when 2.4 billion people are doing something. What it means to be transforming into a digital business. One, taking full advantage of mobile. And when we look at this, we're looking at this both from an internal, so communication with the carriers, or mobile dashboards that you're using in your processing networks, as well as the ability to communicate with your customers and that engagement. The high performers think mobile first, and so you're seeing them invest in implementations that are on a handheld or a smartphone, and less investment on what you would access from a desktop, for example. This consumer relationship is becoming more and more important, and as I'm out talking to some of our retail clients, what I find is that they are very interested in creating that intimacy, and Posts need to be very interested in creating that consumer and customer intimacy as well. My hypothesis is this is probably the most important thing going on in the industry right now. If there's one thing you could do to invest to protect parcel market share, it would be to develop out a consumer relationship and turn that into a channel. They're investing up and down the e-commerce ecosystem, and we've seen a lot about that today, whether it's marketplaces or fulfillment or warehousing, those sorts of things, and then they're enabling self-service. I think the presentation from the Polish Post today had some good examples of where self-service can be very effective. So as we looked at this, we went back out to our digital business and we said, what are we hearing? And they said, high performers are looking at this from two different dimensions. An internal digital enterprise dimension, right? So they're using this digital business to drive more efficiency, to drive new capabilities and platforms, and they're also looking at it from a customer-facing channels and markets sort of perspective. And I asked you to keep that paradigm in your mind as we go through these next few slides. Omnichannel is the topic in the retail practice today. They're all talking about it, they're all experimenting with it, and we've done some research that I'm going to walk you through a few slides that talks about what's important from an omnichannel sort of experience. But you see here some of the points. Amazon with their own network, showrooming, and what we're finding is that showrooming and web rooming are starting to interact. It's bringing new sorts of customers into the aisles of the brick and mortar companies. That unprecedented direct access. I was with one of our big brand companies a couple of months ago, And they talked about two things. One, that they're shipping things that they never thought they would ship before. All right, they're shipping diapers and toilet paper and those sorts of things. But the second is they're doing it direct to the consumer. They've established that relationship and they're being able to push those through subscription sorts of services. And that subscription model is going to change the access that these brands have directly to the consumer. If you look at this ship-to-store sort of phenomenon, what Walmart is doing, 50% of their orders that are online orders are fulfilled through the store. As I talk to e-tailers and retailers out there, what I hear is that this is a competitive advantage for the retailers that they're trying to take advantage of, and we're going to show some slides of how they're taking advantage. But their target is 70% of online transactions to run through their store network. And they talk about why, when they talk about why, it's not necessarily because of a different customer experience, and it's not even necessarily because of cost. It's because it's core to their strategy. Because they need to find ways to get more people into the brick and mortar locations, and having them come to the store and do ship to store is a great way to drive traffic. And so it's a key strategic initiative. 45% are going to have that omni-channel experience, and 40% are going to be impacted by something that they find on the web or mobile. So as we went out and talked to retailers, this is global research that we did, asking retailers, the first thing we asked them was, what are the sorts of things that are of most strategic importance to you from an omni-channel perspective? And we gave them the opportunity to pick 5 of these items. You see the top one there, buy online, pick up in the store, right? 56% put it in their top 5, 11% saying it's number 1. But if you look down, the biggest number 1 contender out there was buy online and ship from the store. So the ability to take advantage of the store as a access point and then ship from that store to the local delivery. This is an area where Post could play a very important role because you have local fulfillment networks that are in place that are usually the lowest cost fulfillment networks. And so this trend of omnichannel is producing both challenges and opportunities. And while it's going to decrease the distances, and as we do this research on parcel trends, what we're finding is distance is decreasing and size or weight are declining. But as you take advantage of that, optimizing your network for a local delivery sort of experience could make a lot of sense. We then asked top 3 reasons for investing in an omni-channel experience. And what you see here is the number 1 by a clear margin is the time factor, that it enables them to get those products to the customer faster. As you think about why e-tailers are so aggressively looking at their own networks, it's all about speed and time. Right? The buyer value that they have not yet been able to address is instant gratification. They know that the brick and mortar have that advantage, and so they're working on speed. We have a team that's working on at Amazon, and you can look at the published results of what Amazon is able to do. From the time that you place an order to the time that it's in somebody's network is 2 hours. And their intent is to get that down to about 30 minutes. All about speed, about taking time out of that transaction, and that's why same day as a phenomena is something that will continue to grow in purpose. Switching over a little bit, so that was retailers. Now we went to the consumers. This was research that we did, 13,000 consumers across 12 different countries, and we asked a bunch of questions around value that they would put on various services, the frequency that they would use these services, and their willingness to pay for those services. And then we asked a bunch of demographic questions and experiential questions. And what we found is people get a lot of packages. You can see the breakdown. The US is where we see the highest number of people getting at least 1 package per week. But package volumes are increasing. And the overall parcel experience, about 35% of consumers said it wasn't an easy experience. So there's 35% of the consumers out there that are having difficulty with that experience. We then ask them to explain what's wrong with that experience, and what you see here are the categories of the answers. And about 70% of these problems can be addressed by giving consumers control over the delivery experience. And you've heard a couple of speakers earlier today talk about the importance of giving consumers control. My perspective on this is the next track and trace. If you look at what was important about track and trace 10 or 15 years ago, it was what it enabled for your largest customers, that providing something into your network was no longer a black box. The missing piece today is depot to door, that last bit where a consumer doesn't have control. And the e-tailers, if you look at their research, will tell you that 70% of their customers make a decision to repeat purchase from them based on the delivery experience. So 35% are having a bad experience, and control addresses 70% of the problem. Is why I would say that this is the most important thing that a Post could be focused on right now, is developing that consumer relationship and enabling control. Here you see, I think it's about 10 of those services on frequency, value, and the size of the bubble is the willingness to pay. What I found most interesting about this is that there isn't a correlation between willingness to pay and value. So for example, you've got tracking that is a small bubble, but highly used and highly valued, not very willing to pay necessarily for that. And that's going to vary by market and culture. But you do see that there are some that are very appealing. Delivery scheduling, accelerated delivery, secure delivery, ability to redirect. These are services that customers say they'll use fairly frequently. They place a high value and they're willing to pay for those. As we then looked at this, we said, all right, can we break this down? I guess I can't. Can you move the forward one? I appear to be stuck. There we go. So we said, could we take this data and run it through some analytical models and see what the data is telling us? And what we found is that there were 5 distinct segments in this data. And we ran this through 3 different models and found the 5 same segments. So we're pretty confident in what we found here. Willingness to pay along the bottom, value and frequency along the side. And what you see is that there is this about 15, 16% of the population in our research that had a high willingness to pay, a high value, and a high frequency of use. And what you find about them is they tend to be urban, they tend to be younger, they get more business parcels. That doesn't mean the majority of what they get are business parcels, but they get more business parcels than the average, and they tend to be full-time employed. And when you look at it on the left, they get a lot more parcels than the average consumer, and they have a much higher level of difficulty. 29% more likely to call the experience very difficult, the delivery experience very difficult. So it's a consumer base that is important, probably your highest margin customers. They're using the services that are out there today, and they're willing to pay for those services, and they're the customers that are most likely to be poached by your competitors as these new models enter the market. So quickly now, looking at digital from a horizon perspective, there's a few things that we talk about that Post should be thinking about as they move forward. One is identity services. The role that the Post could play in this new e-commerce ecosystem of managing identity and authentication. You've got capillarity or reach with your networks, whether it's the Postman network or the branch network, and you've got trust in your brand. And those are 2 important things that will be necessary elements for whoever will manage identity. Mobility and continuing to think mobile first. It's about taking out keystrokes and implementing clicks. And the better that you are at enabling your customers to ship easily with you without a lot of data entry on the phone, the better you'll be at taking friction out of that transaction and driving volume your way. And then analytics, Posts have a lot of data, and we're finding that Posts are struggling to use that data effectively. Analytics will be a differentiator going forward. The last 2, I'll save 3D printing because Pat, I think, is going to cover that much better than I could. Drones is one that when I talk to clients about drones, they always roll their eyes because it seems very far off. A couple of data points on this one. The first, company called Matternet has just about 6 months ago finished a proof of concept where they delivered 70,000 parcels over the course of 2 months. And what they found is that those parcels, that delivery, the elements of that delivery, 20 kilometers, 2 kilos, 24 cents. 70,000 parcels, and that's the math that they came back with. Which means if you can implement a drone network in your country to handle some of your highest cost, you're taking 90-ish% of the cost out of the delivery event. I'm not sure when it's going to happen, but I am sure that something's going to happen in this space. And when it does, it will be the biggest disruptor that has hit the industry. And there are a number of companies that are already experimenting with drones. The second data point, in the US, there was a florist that had started doing drone deliveries in Michigan. And the FAA told them they had to stop. And about 3 months ago, the courts ruled that the FAA had no jurisdiction and they could restart their drone deliveries. So there's a florist in Michigan that is now using drones to do delivery. Again, not going to happen today or tomorrow, but if you don't have it on your 5-year roadmap and a strategy to address drones, you'll be left behind by this, and when it happens, it will be an enormous disruptor. Finally, to wrap up, as we look back at that high performance sort of concept, we've got a model here around what it takes to be a high performer. All the high performers have a strategy to defend the core, and that's not just cost takeout, it's addressing revenue as well. All of them have a strategy to grow their parcel network, and they're defending their home markets very effectively, and they're geographically expanding. All the high performers have a diversification strategy, and it doesn't really matter which it is, whether it's around your retail network or your logistics network or your delivery network, but 3% annual growth, compound annual growth, comes from that diversification agenda. And then last, they wrap it all in becoming a digital organization. We've talked a lot about what that means. Some things to think through as you think about implementing high performance: talent transformation and the ability to get a new type of worker in there that comes with a background in these digital technologies will be important. That customer focus, and in particular a consumer focus, in developing out those relationships. Using the data that you have to better manage the business. Pushing against the USO to get it to something sustainable, and the governance models that allows you to operate commercially. And then last but not least, the investment strategy. What we find is the high performers have dominated the market, or have dominance in the market in at least 2 of their diversified areas. The low performers do not have dominance in any. They have over-diversified in a lot of ways. So focusing those investments to get to critical mass and scale is what's going to drive up EBIT in the non-mail products. With that, thank you for your time today.